Welcome to the deep dive. You've given us a really incredible set of sources this time around. They all seem to touch on this idea of the importance of rethinking. And that's exactly what we want to do today, sort of pull out those golden nuggets, the most interesting and valuable insights from all this material about how we can get better at rethinking what we think we know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we update so many things in our lives all the time, right? Our phones, our clothes, our homes. But for some reason, when it comes to our own knowledge and opinions, we can get a little stuck. Psychologists have a name for this, seizing and freezing. We kind of grab onto an idea and then we just hold on tight. We like that feeling of certainty, even if it means we might be missing out on something new.
Right. And the thing is, in a world that's changing as fast as ours, that ability to rethink, well, it's more important than ever. I mean, think about the start of the pandemic. A lot of leaders, they were slow to change their thinking about how serious the virus was, how it spread. I mean, compared to the flu, right?
Right.
And those consequences of not rethinking those early assumptions, well, they were huge.
Totally. And it's not just, recent events either. One of the sources you sent actually reminded me of this U.S. Forest Service policy. They had this rule up until 1978 that every wildfire had to be put out by 10 a.m. the next day. And that assumption, that refusal to rethink the role of fire in nature, well, it had some really tragic results. The Man Gulch wildfire, for example. A perfect example of how clinging to an outdated idea can have devastating consequences.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder. So, for this deep dive, we don't just want to explore why we struggle to rethink. We actually want to give you, the listener, some tools, some practical takeaways so you can start to cultivate that rethinking mindset in your own life, your work, wherever you need it. So let's jump right in, and we'll start with something that, well, it might surprise you. This idea that our first instinct, that gut feeling, isn't always the best guide. There's research showing that when we change our answers, we actually often change them from wrong to right.
Yeah, there was a review of over 30 studies that showed this. And one of the most interesting pieces of evidence, well, it looked at eraser marks on over 1,500 student exams in Illinois. Turns out that only about a quarter of those changes were from a right answer to a wrong one. But half of them, they were actually correcting a mistake.
So much for always going with your gut, right? Yeah, it really challenges that, doesn't it? And it's funny because, when I think about my own classrooms, you don't see a ton of erased answers on those final exams. But the students who do go back and reconsider, often they see a real improvement in their grades. So maybe that voice in our head telling us to trust our first thought, well, maybe we shouldn't always listen to it. And that brings us to this idea that rethinking, well, it's not just about having the right mental tools. It's about actually remembering to use them. It's a skill and it's a mindset all rolled into one.
And speaking of skills, one of your sources talked about this really cool experiment they did with Italian startup founders. It showed how just a small shift in their thinking about their businesses could have a big impact on their success. They took these entrepreneurs who were in this training program, and they split them into two groups. But they didn't tell them that, of course. One group got the standard entrepreneurship training, the usual stuff. But the other group, they were encouraged to look at their startups through a scientific lens.
A scientific lens. Okay, I'm intrigued. What does that even look like in a business setting?
Basically, they were taught to treat their business strategy like a scientific theory. So their customer interviews became a way to test hypotheses. And that initial product, that was just the first experiment. Something to be tested and refined based on what they learned. The whole point was to approach their ventures with a spirit of inquiry, to be open to changing course based on the data they gathered.
Okay, I get it. So what happened? Did this scientific thinking actually make a difference for these startups?
Well, the research suggests it did. The founders, who were taught to think more like scientists, they actually saw better results for their businesses. It's a great example of the power of a systematic, evidence-driven approach, even in fields that seem, more creative and less rigid, like starting a company. It's all about testing, learning, adapting, that kind of constant feedback loop. And, your sources also brought up something really interesting about intelligence. It turns out that being smart doesn't automatically make you good at rethinking.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can even hold you back.
Yeah, this is where things get really fascinating. And the story of Mike Lazaridis at BlackBerry, well, it really highlights this point. I mean, here's a brilliant guy, right? Instrumental in developing these groundbreaking devices. But he seemed to struggle with adapting to the changing market. BlackBerry was king for so long, but they really clung to this idea of the BlackBerry being the only game in town. They missed the boat on the broader smartphone trend, and even more importantly, they really fumbled instant messaging.
Yeah, you're right. Even when people inside the company were suggesting they add encrypted text messaging, which seems so obvious now. Lazaridis was hesitant. He was worried that if people could use BlackBerry Messenger on other devices, it would make the BlackBerry itself obsolete. And that resistance to change, it led them to abandon instant messaging altogether. A market that, as we know, WhatsApp completely dominated later on. It's a powerful reminder that even if you're a genius in one area, it doesn't mean you're automatically open to rethinking in others. Sometimes your expertise can actually create blind spots.
That's such a good point. And the sources even included this anonymous letter, right, from a high-level BlackBerry employee. And they were warning the leadership, saying that they were, and I quote, 3 to 4 years too late in terms of rethinking their screen and software. It just shows how doubly entrenched those initial beliefs can become, how they can lock us into a certain way of seeing things. But the story doesn't end there, does it? I mean, your sources also contrasted BlackBerry's story with that of Apple.
They did. And, Apple, they were facing their own near-death experience at one point. But they managed this amazing comeback. And a big part of that was their willingness to rethink everything, not just their products, but their whole business model. It just goes to show that it's never too late to embrace that rethinking mindset. So let's shift gears a little bit now and talk about how we see ourselves. Your sources brought up these two really interesting and kind of opposing ideas, the Dunning-Kruger effect and imposter syndrome.
Yeah, these are both so important when it comes to, well, accurately assessing our own knowledge and skills, which of course is key to knowing when we need to rethink. The Dunning-Kruger effect and the story about Davy Oddsson, the governor of Iceland's central bank, really illustrates this. He had no background in finance, but he still thought he could run the central bank. It shows how we can overestimate our own abilities, especially when we don't have the expertise in a particular area.
It's a wild story, isn't it? A guy with no financial experience leading the central bank. And then Parliament had to actually pass a law requiring a master's degree in economics just to remove him from office. He seemed totally oblivious to his own limitations. And that's what the Dunning-Kruger effect shows us, right? That the less we know, the more confident we tend to be. And that can make us really resistant to rethinking because we don't even realize we need to. We literally don't know what we don't know. And that leads to this overconfidence, especially in areas where we think having a certain skill is desirable or in areas where we lack direct experience. It's interesting, though, absolute beginners, they rarely fall into this trap.
Right, because they're aware of how much they don't know. Okay, so on the other side of the spectrum, we have imposter syndrome, where competence actually outweighs confidence. We see this with Hala Tomasdóttir. Despite all the public support, all these people believing in her leadership, she still wasn't convinced that she was qualified to lead. She couldn't see her own strengths. And imposter syndrome, well, it can prevent us from even trying new things, from challenging existing ideas, simply because we lack that self-belief.
Right. And what's fascinating is that both the Dunning-Kruger effect and imposter syndrome show this gap between our actual abilities and how we perceive them. One leads to overconfidence and a resistance to rethinking, while the other can make us undervalue ourselves and hesitate to put our ideas out there. But your sources pointed to this sweet spot, right, between these two extremes, confident humility. So what is that exactly, and why is it so important for this whole rethinking mindset?
Confident humility is, well, it's like having faith in your own abilities while still acknowledging that you could be wrong. It's about believing in your capacity to achieve your goals while also being humble enough to question your current approach. It's this balance that lets us re-examine what we think we know and actively seek out new information. And there's research to support this, right? I mean, you mentioned some studies on leadership effectiveness in the sources.
Yeah, there was research done in both the U.S. and China that found that the most effective and innovative teams, they were led by people who were high in both confidence and humility. So they trust themselves, but they also recognize their own limitations. And they're always looking for ways to learn and adapt. It's kind of cool to think about, right? Even these really successful people, they might still experience self-doubt. In fact, your sources even talked about the benefits of these imposter thoughts.
That does seem counterintuitive. How could feeling like an imposter actually be a good thing?
Well, the idea is that these feelings can actually drive us to behave in more positive ways. There was this research with medical students and investment professionals. And it showed that the ones who reported having these imposter feelings, they often had a better bedside manner and they received higher performance reviews. It makes sense, right? It might push people to be more empathetic, more respectful, more professional, and they're probably better learners too, more likely to seek out feedback from others and recognize that they always have more to learn. So a little bit of self-doubt, well, it can actually be a good thing for growth and development. And, we often think of being wrong as something negative, but your sources actually suggested that there can be a joy of being wrong. Sounds kind of strange at first, right?
It does, yeah. But it's actually a really important idea when it comes to developing a rethinking mindset. You mentioned in the sources how some people are actually thrilled when they discover they're wrong because it means they've learned something new. You gave the examples of Nobel Prize winning scientists and top election forecasters, people who actually enjoy being wrong. That's a pretty different way of looking at things.
Totally. Think about it. Someone who used to pride themselves on being Mr. Facts can actually evolve into someone who's much more interested in exploring what they don't know. There's that great quote from Ray Dalio. If you don't look back at yourself and think, wow, how stupid I was a year ago, then you must not have learned much in the last year. And it's about separating your opinions from your identity, isn't it? Your sources use some pretty strong analogies to illustrate this point.
They did, yeah. Like, imagine a doctor whose identity is professional lobotomist, or a teacher who defines themselves as corporal punisher. It shows how messed up things can get when our sense of self is tied to outdated beliefs or practices. Instead, your sources suggest that we should define ourselves by our values, those core principles that guide us, like excellence, generosity, integrity. That gives us a lot more flexibility to update our beliefs as new evidence comes along. And, the election forecasters, they really embody this, don't they? Like Jean-Pierre Bougams, the military historian with that incredible track record. He's even changed his own political and religious beliefs over time.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And what's fascinating about Jean-Pierre is that he approaches forecasting like a scientist. He's got this passionate detachment. He doesn't rely on those traditional polls. He looks at these often overlooked factors, these hard-to-measure things. And Kirsten Morel, the MIT engineer turned forecaster, she said something really interesting. She said, "There's no benefit to me for being wrong for longer. It's much better if I change my beliefs sooner, and it's a good feeling to have that sense of a discovery, that surprise." So it's like this comfort with being wrong, this joy of discovery, that's what actually makes them so good at what they do.
Exactly. And your sources highlighted this paradox, right? That great thinkers are comfortable being wrong in the short term because they're terrified of being wrong in the long run. So it motivates them to be constantly open to course correction. And that quote from Jeff Bezos really sums it up. People who are right a lot listen a lot, and they change their mind a lot. If you don't change your mind frequently, you're going to be wrong a lot. And it takes courage, doesn't it, to admit when you've been wrong, especially publicly. The story of Andrew Lyne, the physicist who had to retract his big discovery, was really powerful.
It was. And, instead of facing ridicule, he actually got a standing ovation. For his honesty, for his willingness to admit that he'd made a mistake. It shows that admitting we were wrong, well, it doesn't make us look less competent. It can actually enhance our reputation. It shows integrity. It shows a commitment to learning. So let's move on to the idea of conflict. We often try to avoid it, but your sources suggested that a certain type of conflict can actually be really valuable for rethinking.
Yeah, that's right. And the key is understanding the difference between, relationship conflict and task conflict. Relationship conflict is personal, right? It's those clashes that are based on personality, and that's generally not productive. But task conflict, that's about disagreements about the work itself, and that can actually be really beneficial for creativity and decision making. One meta-analysis of over 8,000 teams actually showed that a little bit of disagreement about the work itself can lead to more creative solutions. It means embracing that respectful debate, being willing to challenge each other's ideas and push each other to rethink those initial approaches. So how do we actually foster that kind of task conflict, that good conflict, without letting it devolve into personal attacks? Well, your sources gave some really interesting examples, like Brad Bird at Pixar. When he was working on The Incredibles, he actually sought out misfits, people who were willing to challenge the status quo, to poke holes in ideas. And even though there were some initial doubts, the film ended up being a huge success. And there are more formal ways to build in this kind of constructive challenge, too. Your sources mentioned challenge networks.
Right, exactly. So things like the Pentagon's murder boards and Google's moonshot factory, these are designed to foster task conflict. They bring in people specifically to critically evaluate proposals, to play devil's advocate. And even the peer review process in science, that's a form of a challenge network.
Right.
And sometimes the feedback, well, it can be pretty blunt. Like that story about Adam Grant receiving a rejection letter that basically told him to go back and read his own work. It's important to manage this task conflict effectively, though, to make sure everyone has a chance to be heard.
Absolutely. You don't want the more dominant voices in the room, whether because of their personality or their status, to drown out the perspectives of, newcomers, introverts, women, minorities. And it's good to remember that being agreeable doesn't always mean agreeing intellectually. It's often about trying to maintain social harmony. You can disagree with someone and still be respectful. In fact, sometimes disagreeing can actually be a sign of respect, right? It means you value their views enough to actually engage with them critically. Your sources also mention this idea of the illusion of explanatory depth. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the illusion of explanatory depth is this tendency we have to think we understand things way better than we actually do. And this applies even to simple, everyday objects, like a bicycle or a piano. When someone asks us to explain how those things work, we often realize that our knowledge is a lot more shallow than we thought. And that realization, well, it can be a real eye-opener. It can make us rethink our assumptions and encourage us to seek out a deeper understanding, kind of like what happened with the Wright brothers, right? They had all these arguments, these debates, and it ultimately led them to a much more sophisticated understanding of flight. So we've talked a lot about individual rethinking, but what about when we're trying to help other people rethink their opinions? Your sources had some really interesting things to say about this whole idea of interpersonal rethinking.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. This is where we go from thinking like scientists ourselves to trying to encourage others to do the same. And your sources contrasted those more confrontational approaches, like the preacher, the prosecutor, the politician modes of argumentation. They contrasted those with a more collaborative, scientist-like approach, one that's built on humility and curiosity. That story about the logic bully really stood out to me. Adam Grant realized that sometimes, trying to overwhelm someone with rational arguments can actually backfire. It can make them dig in their heels even more.
Yeah, totally. And a good debate, it shouldn't be about winning or losing. It's more like a dance, right? You have to adapt to your partner's moves. And the research on expert negotiators actually showed this. They emphasize finding that common ground, acknowledging when they've changed their own minds, asking more questions than making statements. They even pay attention to feelings. Like Harish Natarajan, the world champion debater. His strategy was to start by highlighting areas of agreement with his opponent, who is much younger than him. It's not just about the number of reasons you give either. It's about how those reasons fit together. That university fundraising experiment really showed this.
Right. Presenting a coherent narrative, like the opportunity to do good versus just feel good, that can be much more persuasive than just throwing a bunch of different reasons at someone. And, expert negotiators, they're also much more tuned to the emotional side of the conversation. They're constantly checking their understanding of the other person's feelings. And that tactic that Michelle used in her cover letter, that was really clever.
Yeah, admitting a potential weakness right up front. It's like preempting that rejection, It showed self-awareness, confidence in her ability to learn. It showed them that they weren't just hiring a set of skills, but someone with the potential to grow. And then there's Daryl Davis with his incredibly unique approach to engaging with white supremacists.
Yeah, Daryl's story is so powerful. He shows how asking those simple, direct questions like, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And just fostering that genuine conversation, that human connection, rather than going into attack mode, can actually open up even the most closed-off minds. His ability to build rapport with people and get them to question these deeply held beliefs, it's remarkable. And, the sources also talked about rivalries like the Red Sox and Yankees, how those strong emotions can make it really hard to rethink.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that study that showed increased brain activity in the reward centers when a rival fails, that shows just how deeply rooted those feelings can be. And what's interesting is that trying to downplay rivalries can actually backfire. So one way to shift this, as your sources suggested, is to highlight the arbitrary nature of group identity, to encourage people to take a broader view, like an astronaut seeing a borderless world from space. But just feeling empathy for an individual within a rival group, well, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll change our stereotypes about the whole group, does it?
That's a great point. While feeling empathy for an individual can make us like them more, it doesn't necessarily change those broader stereotypes. The story about the company founder in China, the one who initially resisted the idea of discrimination, but then recognized a parallel in how Scorpios are stereotyped in the West. That shows how finding that relatable connection, that point of common ground, can be key to getting someone to rethink those broader beliefs. And Daryl Davis's conversations with that KKK exalted Cyclops really highlighted the power of sustained dialogue.
Yeah, they did. Even though the Cyclops started out with these deeply racist beliefs, those conversations with Daryl, over time, they actually led him to rethink his views and eventually leave the clan. And Daryl estimates that he's helped over 200 white supremacists rethink their beliefs. That's incredible. And the challenge of anti-vaccine beliefs, that's such a relevant example, right? Of how difficult it can be to change someone's mind on these deeply held, emotionally charged issues. And the idea of vaccine whisperers using motivational interviewing techniques seems really promising.
It does, yeah. Like Arnaud Gagneur's work in Quebec, he's shown how effective these techniques can be, focusing on guiding rather than directing, listening for those moments of openness to change, asking open-ended questions. And the results are pretty amazing. Even single conversations in maternity wards have led to significant increases in vaccination rates. And, Betty Bickham, her success in negotiating with Joseph Kony of the Lord's Resistance Army, she did it by listening, not by trying to persuade. It just emphasizes the power of this approach. And the core principles of motivational interviewing, things like building trust, asking permission to share information, addressing those fears, affirming their freedom to choose, well, those seem applicable in so many different situations, like that conversation with Jeff about his leadership style, or Arnaud Gagneur's interaction with that vaccine-hesitant mother.
Exactly. And even with really polarized issues like climate change, where we see this binary bias of truth versus denial, embracing that complexity, acknowledging the spectrum of beliefs, well, that can be much more effective than just arguing with one side or dismissing the other. And highlighting those specific situations where an effect might change, that can also make our communication more nuanced, more believable.
Wow.
Your sources also warned about idea cults, right? Those groups that oversimplify complex issues and resist any kind of nuance. They used examples like detox diets, learning styles, those unquestioning beliefs in the universal benefits of, say, meditation or authenticity.
And the scientist's veil of ignorance, that idea of judging a study based on its methods rather than just its conclusion, that's a good reminder for all of us, right? To approach information with a critical and open mind. And what's interesting is that your sources pointed out the limitations of just trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes. They suggested that actually talking to people, seeking out their perspectives directly, well, that's often a lot more effective. And even those really emotionally charged conversations, allowing for mixed feelings, recognizing that we can feel anger and hope, defensiveness and remorse, all at the same time, well, that can create the space for understanding and progress, like that incident with Christian Cooper and Amy Cooper in Central Park. There are a lot of complex emotions at play there.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's think about how we can instill this rethinking mindset in future generations. Your sources had some really cool ideas about teaching students to question what they think they know.
Oh, for sure. Like Erin McCarthy's approach. She uses outdated history textbooks to get her students thinking critically about those historical narratives, to consider whose stories are included and whose are left out. And while it's not practical to delay all learning until later in life, the importance of giving kids early and frequent practice in unlearning those incorrect beliefs, especially in science, that can't be overstated. Those family myth-busting discussions at the dinner table, those are a fantastic way to make rethinking a regular habit. And it seems like that traditional lecture format, while it might be enjoyable, it might not be the best way to develop those critical thinking and rethinking skills.
Right. The research suggests that while students might like lectures, they might even give those instructors higher ratings, active learning actually leads to better long-term understanding. So just passively absorbing information, well, that's not enough to create lifelong learners who can rethink effectively. So what are some more effective approaches?
There are a bunch. Like Adam Grant has his students create their own mini podcasts or TED Talks where they have to question common practices or challenge conventional wisdom. And Lauren McCann, she has this great idea where she has her students write letters to their freshman selves. It encourages them to reflect on how their own perspectives have evolved and to be more open to different paths. And embracing confusion is a cue to explore further, like Ron Berger advocates. It's such a powerful idea. He has the students act like young scientists, engaging in these critique sessions with specific guidelines for constructive feedback. It helps them learn to revise their thinking based on input from others. And finally, let's talk about how we can create cultures of rethinking, cultures that extend beyond individual efforts. Your sources provided some pretty compelling examples here.
Yeah, like Luca Parmitano's near-drowning experience in space. That was due to those minor water leaks in the helmets, leaks that had become, well, normalized. It highlights the danger of not rethinking those assumptions within an organization and echoes the Challenger disaster, right? Which was also linked to a failure to reconsider those known risks. So, creating what's called psychological safety, an environment where people feel comfortable being vulnerable, where they feel like they can question ideas without fear of negative consequences, that's so important for teams to perform well and embrace rethinking. And that requires leaders to demonstrate humility and curiosity consistently over time. Like, the Gates Foundation has this video called Mean Reviews where their senior leaders read aloud this harsh feedback they've received. It's a way to model that vulnerability and encourage that openness.
Yeah, it's a great example. And the importance of independent critical thinking. Even when everyone else seems to be on board, that was so clear in Ellen Ochoa's story. She was the only one who voted against a NASA launch because of concerns about those sensor issues. And your sources also talked about this idea of identity foreclosure, settling on a sense of self too early, which can really limit our willingness to rethink those career paths and life plans. Michelle Obama's critique of that question, what do you want to be when you grow up? That encourages a more adaptable mindset, doesn't it? Thinking of careers as actions rather than fixed identities can also promote more exploration. And just regularly checking in on those life plans and relationships, being open to how we and our partners are evolving, those are so key for a fulfilling life. So it seems like rethinking isn't just about avoiding mistakes or improving our performance, right? It's also deeply connected to our well-being, to our sense of purpose.
It really is. And, your sources suggested that focusing too much on happiness can actually make us less happy. And that emphasizing the frequency of positive emotions, finding that meaning and purpose, nurturing those social connections, that's what really matters, those 3 stages of career self-esteem. Going from I'm not important to I'm important to I want to contribute to something important, that highlights how a focus on contribution often leads to greater impact and happiness. And it seems like planning for learning and contribution in the near term while staying open to those future possibilities, that's a really wise approach. And those stories of the hospital custodians, the ones who redefine their roles to care for the patient's emotional well-being, they remind us that our identities, our lives, they're open systems. And rethinking those daily actions, well, that can lead to a much more fulfilling existence. So to wrap things up, this deep dive has really shown us that rethinking isn't just a nice skill to have, it's a crucial way of navigating this complex world and creating a more meaningful life.
Absolutely. And that blank final page in the book you shared, that's a powerful symbol, isn't it? It represents that ongoing process of thinking and rethinking. It's not about finding the final answer. It's about being open to that constant exploration.
And as a fun example of scientific rethinking, I love that story about the T-Rex. Our understanding of whether it had scales or feathers, that's changed over time as we've made new discoveries. And the feathered Uteranus, that adds another layer to the story. It shows that even our understanding of these seemingly settled facts, well, it can evolve.
Yeah, exactly. And on that note, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought. We encourage you to put on those scientist goggles a little more often and ask yourself, do I really agree with what I think I know? And if not, what evidence would it take to actually change my mind?
That's a great question to ponder.
It is. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.